Carthage must be destroyed. Today we are taking one more step towards destroying Carthage. We are going to continue our Clash of Spears walkthrough. We're getting right into the general game concepts here. And for this game today I've set up a bit of terrain. I've got this river from Gale Force 9, this bridge from Gale Force 9, and these roads that I don't remember where I got from. Novus Designs or something? I don't know. They're older. They work for now. Obviously the Romans have repaired the roads or repaired the bridge and it fell apart again. I don't know. They obviously don't match, but for whatever reason that's that there. And we're going to be using that for the general concepts of the game here. So Clash of Spears, in their general game concepts, they start you out by explaining some very basic and I would even say generic terms that pretty much any wargamer will know. You're going to be using d6 dice, and on the profiles we saw last time there were stats that you have to try to meet or exceed on the dice rolls with, of course, modifiers and the like. It's nothing new for wargaming. Every wargame uses these kind of concepts. The things that they like to cover first in this section of the book is the dice and general rules here. You're going to be rolling d6s to try and test things. If you roll a 1 on d6 on any test here, it says that an unmodified 1 will always be a failure. So don't roll a 1, you will always lose, you will always fail. The other rule here that they put in is that a roll of 6. Now, there's sometimes stats, let's say your profile stat says you need to have a 5+ to pass a test. Okay, a 5+ means a 5 and a 6. But there are instances where modifiers may take you beyond that 6, right? In some games they call it 7 up, and then in this game they're basically saying anything that exceeds a 6 requires a separate test a second time. What do I mean by that? Again, this is a general concept in some games I've seen, where if say you require more than a 6 to pass, you roll a dice, and if you roll a dice and say you roll a 6, okay, then you take that 6, and then you have to roll a second time, and then if you roll 5 or 6 the second time, then you pass, okay? So that's for anything above 6. Basically 7 and up, or anything above 6. You require a 6, and then you have to roll again to get a 5 or 6 to pass. So it's kind of like a really difficult roll, if you will, if they're really modified heavily by negative situations. Also, sometimes you get rerolls in the game and they say all rerolls only happen once. So if you roll once and you're allowed to reroll in a certain situation, the second roll is the ruling roll and that's the final roll. So you can't just go back and use the first roll. All right. So all of these are very general, basic game concepts that you see in many games, and Clash is no different. So it should be very familiar for people picking up a game and just getting right into it. The next part of the game, I want to say the general concept section of this book, chapter 3, it starts getting into terrain, and like any skirmish or war game, there are going to be different terrain pieces. They have things in the book like hills, structures that are low or tall, impassable terrain, all that kind of normal stuff wargamers use. We'll go through a couple here and get through them. I'm just going to say this right off the bat. They don't have any rules for occupying buildings yet in the rule book. They may add some in future supplements. I'll show you more of my river here. But there's no rules for buildings yet. They just consider it impassable terrain for Clash of Spears right now. So again, very basic about terrain. You're going to have different kinds of terrain. You're going to have open terrain, and then you're going to have, let's call it, the rule book calls it area terrain. You're basically going to have different levels of terrain. Everyone knows that open terrain is going to be like an open field or a roadway where there's nothing impeding your movement or affecting your fighting ability. But sometimes you come across things like you've got rubble here, ruins, you've got a river, or you've got walls, something like that. Before you start playing, it's important to just discuss with your opponent what the terrain is going to be. What does it represent on the battlefield? Everyone has some different ideas sometimes about what a terrain is. Maybe this is a really shallow river and you can just ford across. Maybe it's actually 7 feet deep. You have to decide these things before you game, and Clash makes sure that all players do that. And I mean, it's totally up to the players how they define it. Like in the book it talks about forests and rocky areas and stuff like that. It's basically saying you have to decide if it's broken, impassable, or rough terrain. So they describe the rough terrain as something that is like a plowed field, or maybe there's a bunch of rocks on a field and soldiers are kind of used to it says. Whereas broken terrain is something more like the treacherous terrain, like very dense woods, dangerous terrain basically. It's like maybe a swamp or something. Terrain that you can go into, but it's kind of difficult to traverse and maybe even dangerous to your life. Now, in this part of the book, it doesn't really explain how rough or broken terrain works yet, and I'm sure we'll get to that later. But just to give you kind of a general concept that, yeah, you need these kind of terrains to play if you want the full experience. I mean, you could do a whole open field battle, but where's the fun in that in a skirmish game? You want to get like bridges and broken walls and hedges and stuff to play on. There's also impassable terrain, which is pretty straightforward. You can't move through it. It can't be interacted with at all. So right now, houses and stuff are impassable terrain. They also describe things as low and high terrain. And, low area terrain means you can see over it. It's not going to block your line of sight. Whereas high terrain is going to be like, trees and tall walls. Things that are going to be harder to detect the enemy behind, basically. So they don't get into the rules about these right away here in the terrain section, as I've said, but they will eventually. So somewhere in the future we'll see the modifiers and the effects of this different terrain throughout the book. And then there's obstacles. There's going to be, I guess they're going to have low and high obstacles. Something like this wall here. I'm going to put a Roman behind here. I would consider this low terrain, and I would just rule out that whatever the rules state about crossing this kind of obstacle, he'd be able to do it. Or if this wall was maybe twice as high, I'd say that's something that's high terrain. You can't just cross over it easily. You'll need ladders and equipment. Now, the rule book says here they don't have any rules for that kind of terrain. So there's no like siege warfare or anything in the rule book yet. It's all going to be like open field skirmish battles, but I'm sure at some point they'll add it in a future supplement or an update to the rule book. And finally, for terrain, hills and elevations. I mean, there's going to be hills and cliffs and high points and stuff like that. And it does state here they're difficult to represent on in a model wargame. I agree completely with that statement. But yeah, you're considering hills and stuff to be open terrain, and they will have some advantages, I think, later on. But yeah, generally the terrain section of this part of the book just doesn't get into anything that's new or in reinventing the wheel. It's just giving you general gamer concepts that most people would know, and they need to, because maybe this is the first war game someone plays, so every rulebook should put this kind of section in there. So the next section, line of sight, again very basic. Line of sight is drawn from the front of the unit that's closest. So something like, say, this Roman Hastati here, he draws a line of sight straight towards these guys. They can see them, as can these guys see them. And these guys can see both of them because they all have 360-degree vision when they're kind of in their open order formations here. So line of sight is just drawn like so. Line of sight will be blocked by friendly units that are in your way. So these velites who are in front of these Hastati here, the Hastati wouldn't be able to see them at all, because this unit would be blocking their line of sight. Everyone in the same unit can see the same unit, but if from other units will block another unit's line of sight. So this section here I'm refilming for line of sight, because I think my line of sight explanation was a little weird. I'm not going to use models, I'm just going to use diagrams. For line of sight, it's saying that if you want to target a unit that's behind two objects or enemies or friends, you need at least 2 inches between them to be able to target them. Here there's not 2 inches, so you wouldn't be able to see them for line of sight. This terrain feature in this unit is blocking this unit's line of sight. The other thing here is that in the game, if you have fellows that are in a 6-inch distance within terrain, or have some sort of terrain that they're in that's 6 inches, these guys won't be able to see each other within those 6 inches, because all the terrain between them has essentially blocked them. If they're closer than 6 inches and it's not too high, like super high trees, they'd probably be able to see each other. I mean, this is why you have to decide what your terrain is before playing. And obviously they can't see them here because this terrain feature is 6 inches more and they won't be able to draw line of sight. And finally, the hill section that I botched up before. The hill here, if they're up on a hill and they want to shoot down at this enemy over here, they can't, because they're within 3 inches here. They have to be over 4 inches away to be able to see them. It also states in the rules that you have to be an inch higher than something you're shooting at. So it has to be, so if there's something, maybe these guys are an inch up and these guys are 2 inches, then they can see them and they can see them back. So we're going to look at measuring now. Measuring distances is pretty straightforward. You measure between the models that are closest to each other and have line of sight. So you would measure from this guy to this guy for determining the distance between units. It says if no models can see each other, you can still measure between them. You just use the closest model to the closest model. Now there might be situations where, and this game does allow pre-measuring at any time, so you can pre-measure any time, but there may be distances where like maybe there's a tree or something up here, and you know, you still want to see how far away they are for maybe there's a test later or something on in the rules, but that basically is allowed. They don't have to see each other. You can still pre-measure at any point. And it also says that you can't remove casualties in a way that would increase the range to the attacking unit. It says in the range, right? You'd have to move it from the back, because if you remove that, you increase the distance between them. Sorry, I botched that one up as well. But yeah, don't remove them. Basically, that makes the range increase between them. Take it from the back, and that's how it should work. All right, in this next part here, it starts to introduce morale and fatigue. In war, there is often going to be a lot of fighting, especially in this era, and how long do people go on before they get too tired? Well, I mean, if you're physically fit, you might be able to go for a bit, but how long can you truly go? Do you think you can swing a sword around for an hour without getting too tired? Who knows? Clash likes to take this into consideration. They are looking at different actions and battle fatigue and morale and how it affects it. So Clash is unique in the sense that they want to make it so all your actions give you fatigue points and the results of actions and taking damage and the like. So it starts to get into actions and fatigue here. Fatigue can be recovered if you rest by not moving, I assume, and also by rallying troops with the commanders and stuff like that. So let's get right into the actions and fatigue. You look at this chart here and you see something called action tokens. It doesn't discuss it in this chapter, it comes later, but you as a unit can make basically 3 actions, and that's how you read this chart. So if you have a lightly armored guy whose save is 6 or worse, you can see here he can do like 3 actions through open terrain, no issue. Whereas like he gets into rough terrain on his 3rd action, he's going to develop some fatigue. In broken terrain, he's going to develop more fatigue if he does 2 or 3 action. So just to be clear here, don't worry about action tokens yet, because they start explaining them in the next chapter. But basically a unit can make 3 moves, 3 actions, that is. It's just not moves, it's actions. They can do 3 actions. And if they are doing actions inside these terrains, this is the fatigue they get based on their armor save or how heavily they're weighed down. So a heavily armored guy is not going to operate as is hardcore in rough or broken terrain. They're going to be slower essentially. They're going to develop more fatigue if they do heavy actions moving around. So the fatigue accumulated will always come after the action. So if you guys already have some fatigue on them and they fight, they use that fatigue, and if that attack that they just did would add more fatigue, you don't worry about that fatigue until the end, okay? So they haven't really gone through the rules yet on how fatigue works. They're just telling you a chart and what situation fatigue will come in and how it affects terrain. And I'm sure fatigue will start popping up more with actions and other stuff like that. But we'll look at that later. I think they just wanted to give you a general idea that actions have consequences and cause fatigue in the game. And moving into rough terrain with certain armor affects that. The other thing that's going to cause fatigue is through the exposure of the horrors of battle, is what they describe it as here. And you get constantly attacked or you lose buddies in the fighting, guess what? You're going to get fatigue and morale affected on the unit. So some seasoned troops are going to be better than other troops for taking it. Like if you guys just got together and it's your first fight, you know, you're a levied troop, and you see a bunch of people die in front of you, you're probably more likely to run away than a guy who's been serving in the army for 10 years, you know. Hannibal's veterans or something, they've seen some pretty crazy crap in their days. So anyway, the morale test's effective for units in different ways, and that's what we're going to talk about here. It starts getting into the different ways morale tests are triggered. It says here, whenever a unit suffers at least 1 hit from melee or missile, if those hits are saved by armor, they're even triggered. So what does that mean? So if you are hit by armor, if you're hit by armor, that would suck too. But if you're hit by an attack, so let's say that the weapon hits you, be it melee or ranged weapon, then a morale test is going to happen. Even if you save it, you're going to have to take a morale test. That will trigger a morale test, okay? It also says if an enemy unit within 4 inches of line of sight destroys a friendly unit through melee by killing the last model, or there's too much fatigue and that unit's wiped out, that triggers a morale test. And it has to be 4 inches in line of sight for simplicity. So, you know, if you're within 4 inches of a unit dying, that's going to trigger a morale test. Okay? If a friendly character is killed within 10 inches of line of sight. So, that will figured well. You know, if their general, if their boss man suddenly dies and he's 10 inches away, that would cause some worry in the ranks. So that will cause a morale test. And then there's some other tests that are in special rules, but we won't go through those yet. So when a morale test is triggered, you roll a single d6. However, you're going to add, I'll reach over here, you're going to add d6 depending on what has happened. Every time you have an unsaved wound due to like a melee attack or a missile attack that triggered the test, you count all those wounds, even overkill, which I guess they have some rules for, as an additional d6. So if a melee attack was thrown at these guys, let's say they throw a javelin at them and they save it, no wound was taken, according to the rules, if they suffered a hit, if these guys hit successfully, these guys would still do a morale test even though he saved it. Maybe that was a very impressive throw and it scares them away. But 1d6 probably is not so bad. But if that one throw killed a man, you would add another d6 to the roll, okay? And if for whatever reason they also saw their buddies or whatever, I don't know, so maybe another unit is wiped out or a character is triggered, that's another d6, okay? So there's all these little d6s you're going to add to a morale test. And there might be some traits that offer another d6 added, like maybe they're fresh troops or something, we'll look at those later, and they're already naturally cowardly and scared. They may have another d6. But basically you add a d6, 1d6 for every unsaved wound due to a melee attack, and 1d6 for every enemy unit. It's either going to be, friendly unit within 4 inches or a commander within 10 inches. So you can see some of these things might add up really quickly depending how well you save or take hits in Clash. And then this is where you look at grit. Grit was that stat in the profile from last video. This is where you're comparing it with the morale test. So let's say my grit is really low. Let's say it's 3. They're seasoned soldiers and they have to take 3 dice after adding it all. And they all match or beat it. So here, no problem. Their grit was only 3. They take the hits. They're good. They're okay. They don't take any fatigue points. If any of these failed, you'd add a fatigue point to that unit. Of course, these rolls could be modified depending if they're already fatigued or some other stat, but let's just assume for this instance they weren't. They just take it, and they're okay, nothing wrong here. So the commander, essentially, if it's based on a range attack or seeing something die, the commander can spend a command point, a CP point, a CP, and they add a d6 here to the overall roll, and then you're allowed to eliminate one individual failed result. So it kind of gives you a chance to roll high and take out a failed result. And if it's a melee attack, you can only use a CP if the character is attached to that unit. So the commander, if it's attached to the unit, can benefit them. Otherwise, if he's if he's around it close enough, I don't think it says he has to be in command range. Okay, so he can't be just far off in the distance. He has to be in command range in order to roll the CP for a missile attack or a ranged trigger attack or a destroyed unit trigger. And actually, the result I did there is exactly I just realized that they have grit 3 here. I did the same thing here, and they gain 2 points of fatigue here. That's basically what I just explained. I gave my Sam Knight, my light guys, super veteran Sam Knight stats, and they had grit 3. I had better results in this. So these guys have taken 2 points of fatigue. There's also morale tests here. No, that's a morale test example 1. Here's another one. And this is just explaining how the commander would have worked, where they add a CP to it. He rolls here, and then he's like, okay, well, I have one bonus one that gave me 1 extra. I'll delete the failed result. And then he only has to take away 1 fatigue instead of 2. That's how the commander works. There's a guy running away. He obviously has failed his command. His CP didn't work for him, I believe. Finally, this is the last section of part 3, the effects of fatigue. Obviously, if you're fatigued, it's going to affect your mental abilities, and it's going to affect how you fight. The first thing it says here is they've got units that are stalled. Fatigue will make units hesitate. If you have 2 fatigue points or more from a melee attack or a missile attack, they may suddenly be stalled. So while you're playing, let's say a unit's moving along and they get shot at, I'm just putting in a what-if scenario. I don't know how it works, if that's how it's going to work, but if they're in the middle of an action and they suddenly take 2 fatigue points from melee or missile attacks, they're suddenly stopping. They're hesitated. You know, 2 guys died or something happened to them, spooks the unit. That happens when they suddenly take 2 fatigue points. So if these guys are marching along and they suddenly take 2, they just quit their action. They're stalled. And I think we'll look more into details of that later on. And there's also some rules about reacting units that could also be affected by this, but we will look at that later. So it gets into a chart here about the effects of fatigue points on your unit. And just prior to this set part here, it talks about how a test and activation effect. If you've accumulated some fatigue on your unit, you have to do an activation test. And the book says I'll talk about it later. But if you're a fresh troop and you have no fatigue, you don't have to worry about any sort of a command or a command from a commander or anything. You're going to just move around fine. You just assume you're commanded. But if you have fatigue, you're going to start doing activation tests. We'll look at that later. This here is a fatigue chart that explains your modifications for the fatigue. So if you have 1 point of fatigue, pretty much everyone's okay. If you have 2 points of fatigue, you start losing combat and shoot rolls, right? These are modifiers to the dice rolls. And as you see, as you keep going down here, you start to kind of get really bad at fighting and taking things. So these are going to be modified by the amount of fatigue you have. And number 7, run for your life. I guess when you get to 7 fatigue, you're running for it. So how does run for your life work? They don't all just book it. What happens is when they get to 6 fatigue, that's their limit. Anything above that, like if they continue to gain fatigue points, they start losing men. The men start running. So if they score 7 fatigue points, you take off 2 wounds. And those 2 wounds, they just represent that these guys ran away. And what makes that worse is that continues to count towards fatigue points. So when people start running away, the unit's really going to start falling apart. You know, there's no worse thing when you're already shaken and scared. When 2 of your buddies run off and you're still there, you're not going to stick around. So it's going to cause even more issues. There's no saves against this. They're done. They're running away. They went and put their head in the river and get the name. But they go and drown themselves in the lake because Hannibal's too scary and they wanted just a way out. Or they bury their heads in the ground. That kind of stuff. Running for your life. So they never do this unless their fatigue's beyond 6. It says here if the fatigue point is double, if the fatigue points of a unit is higher than twice the number of the remaining models, just remove the unit. At that point, they're done. They're gone. They're running. Characters, though, have a special trait that let them stay on the field if they have 6 fatigues. But it does say that anything above 6, they will start taking more wounds on the characters. So sometimes characters will last a little longer, but it seems, but not really. And that is it for part 3, general game concepts.